Okay, right. So let's finally get into the actual,
Go on then.
the final thing. So they didn't start until early July. So July the 5th it kicks off. Again, with actions this big, you can debate what exact day it started, but they usually say the 5th. And that's very late in the summer. That's the latest the Germans ever did an offensive. And I've talked all about it in the last one, so I won't go over it again, why that was. They were pushing it back. Hitler pushed it back loads of times.
Well, because they needed to get the men together.
Yeah, and mainly to get lots of the newest Panther and Tiger tanks into the field, which they rushed too much. So anyway, there was basically a calm before the storm, but like it was 3 months long, really.
God, but that was bad in and of itself. You could feel the tension building. What's happening? Well, millions of men are appearing on our side, and even more millions of men are appearing on their side. And what are we doing? We're sitting here and waiting for hell.
Yeah. It's funny you should call it hell because although, particularly on the Russian side, lots of different accounts for people that survived say things like, I know it's a cliche that war gets described as hell, but this was hell. This was worse than hell. This really was like hell.
It's just the worst environment to ever imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, reading a bunch of the accounts from World War One was bad. You know, the guys are in the craters and they're dying and there's blood everywhere, but you can't go out and save them because then you get shot and then there's more death and it's like, oh God, this is awful. You know, like how much worse could this get? But this must have been like that, you know, on steroids. This must have been so much worse.
Yeah, yeah. The weather played a big part in it because, as I said before, you've got the Russian winter, famously extreme, but then you've got sort of the spring wet season, muddy season. And then you've got summer, which can be very, very, very hot, you know, sort of North Africa hot. Anyway, the Germans really needed the wet, muddy season to be over. If they're going to do mass tank movements, you really want that muddy season to be over. But it was, and then some. Like I say, July, that's deep into the summer now.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, both sides absolutely knew it was all going to go down in and around the Kursk salient. Both sides absolutely knew it was going to happen. There's no surprise.
Yeah.
Now, that's a real problem because from the German point of view, if you're the attacker, you're going to want surprise.
Well, that would be ideal, but...
Yeah. And so to have any element of surprise is better than having none, and they had none. There was really none. And really not even including the sort of Anglo-Soviet spy ring stuff. It was obvious to a blind man by July.
Yeah.
It was like, well, we know they've been massing
Yeah.
whole divisions of tanks over there.
You can probably just look through
months.
binoculars and see just rows and rows of tanks and tons of tents and millions of men. I mean, you can't hide it.
Yeah, you cannot hide it.
Like
You cannot.
It stretches over 1,000 miles. What are you going to do? Hide this, you know? Like, there's no hiding it. Everyone can see and everyone can know. And it's like, right, okay, and one day we're just going to walk towards each other and all die.
The Germans have massed divisions and divisions of tanks and something like 750 or 900,000 men. You can't hide it.
No.
Both sides are doing quite a lot of aerial reconnaissance. Both sides. It was
Probably,
clear
again, unnecessarily. What's going on? Who has a massive army?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, wow. Okay,
We know.
I'll write that down.
Yeah.
Well, I feel quite fatalistic just talking about this. Just like, it's just the industrial grinder of modern warfare at its worst, isn't it? That's the thing.
Yeah.
This is what I was saying when there's clearly a difference between like ancient and medieval warfare and this. You know, there is a tangible moral difference between it all. You know, I'm not saying that, you know, ancient warfare was fun in games. It wasn't. You know, people die and it was terrible. But this is just something else.
Yeah, and where you've got that, like the real horror of the Western Front in World War One, and it hadn't really played out like that in World War Two. It pretty much does here. It's different, of course. It's not exactly the same because it's much more mechanized and things. But all the trench systems and barbed wire, and just millions of men lined up against each other and just charge into a big a whirlpool of death sort of a thing.
I mean,
and both sides know they're going to do that ahead of time, and then they do.
Everyone's had 3 months to dig in, and it's like, oh God. Yeah.
It was, apparently, the psychological strain was particularly on the Russian side because they knew that it was going to be a German attack and they would have to be defensive. So a word about that. That's what it was. The Germans, they're all lining up for getting ready for 3 months, and then the Germans attack, and the Russians are on the defensive. However, that wasn't always necessarily going to be the case. And so in the end, I think it was Vatutin spoke to Stalin and said, look, it's going to be better for us if we defend against them rather than trying to attack them.
Yeah.
Stalin didn't want to do that. Stalin wanted to attack. We've massed 1.3 million men. We've amassed thousands of tanks. We've amassed thousands of fighter planes. We know exactly where they are. They're sitting there. It's July. Why don't we attack them? Why don't we take the initiative and
fair
attack them?
question,
It's not bad.
actually.
It's not crazy.
Yeah.
It's not crazy.
Yeah.
And his generals, the Stavka, said, no, look, it's going to be better if we let them attack, let them exhaust themselves a bit, and then we do giant counterattacks. That's exactly how it played out, incidentally. And that was the best thing, in hindsight, most all military historians agree, that was the best thing to do. It would have been brilliant from the German point of view if the Germans had done that, just waited and waited until the Russians attacked and done what got done to them, to the Soviets, but they didn't. And anyway, there's an interesting story where Vatutin, I think it was Vatutin, has got Stalin on the phone saying, let's be on the defensive sort of deliberately. Sort of one of those moments in time when an individual decision from an individual man's mind can turn all of world history. Apparently there was just a silence on the phone where Stalin's obviously mulling it over. And finally he says, okay, you can be on the defensive, just make sure the counterattacks work. Again, it's one of those moments like Clive of India or like Napoleon or Alexander in his tent or something. Yeah. It's like that decision, so massive, just so massive.
But I mean, it is the more prudent thing to do. 'Cause, I mean, it's easier to defend a position that's even slightly fortified than it is to attack one. So it's... And if you've got an army of the quality of the Russian army, then maybe you think, well, actually, that does make sense, doesn't it? Keep reserves, defense in depth, and then counterattack when they're exhausted. That's actually a very sensible strategy, rather than just throw men at German machine guns. Yeah, because they're just going to die.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And because of course Stalin was some sort of megalomaniac. And in my opinion. Suffering from a type of madness in all sorts of different ways, a psychopath, in my opinion. However, he did take advice, though, and sometimes the right advice at the right time. So where Hitler, as the war went on, actually Kursk is an exception to what I'm about to say, but where Hitler would take more and more responsibility into his own hands, Stalin gave more and more away. He sort of realised he certainly wasn't a tactical genius, and not really a strategic one. He was a politician, a very, very ruthless politician.
That's
what he was.
Wasn't
right,
he?
Okay. And he wasn't a general.
Yeah.
And he sort of knew, he absolutely realised he wasn't. And so even though we'd sort of make the
moments
biggest...
of humility from Stalin.
Yeah, right. Because there's a odd thing to say about Stalin, isn't it? He's like the least humble man ever.
I know, that's what I'm finding funny.
But at the right moment, he realised...
But a humble bureaucrat.
It's funny to say, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But you are right. If he's like, okay, well, I'll delegate the responsibility for the battle to the generals. Big think. Very smart move. Wise, I suppose. Why else would you have them?
So that decision, when he's on the phone and he pauses for a moment and says, okay, be on the defensive, that is a little bit surprising, because you might think, well, Stalin would never do that. That'd be a humiliation to a man like Stalin. But no, he realised that was the right thing. Swallowed his pride on some level and said, okay. But I mean, and it was correct.
Imagine if the Germans had won this and routed and killed like 1 million Russians. That then Russia surely would have been essentially open to the Germans. He can't just pull up another 4 million men out of nowhere with thousands of tanks and thousands of planes. Like, surely he's aware that this is all or nothing now. Because if the Germans break through this, I'm done. There's no way, if the Germans break through with 500,000 men, where am I going to get that, defensive force from? So he must understand that this is like, there's no second army I can pull from the east to bring up here.
Right, yeah. Both sides had amassed, certainly on the German side, but it also applies to the Russian side, a bit less, but it still applies. They basically amassed nearly everything they could.
Yeah.
If one side had decisively beaten the other, because the Wehrmacht isn't wiped out to a man here, But if one side had managed to do that to the other, it would have been. You could argue it might have been curtains for them. You mentioned defence in depth there, and that's exactly what happened around Kursk. That's what the Russians did for that 3-month lull.
Very wise.
They made 3 main lines of defence, but in places, sometimes 8 lines deep. In places where they knew it was sort of coming, up to a couple of 100 mile deep of defence in depth. So the German blitzkrieg, lightning war tactics, you can't do that. That only works if you punch through a line, then you're behind them.
Yeah, and you can go behind them and rout them from the back. And but if it's essentially like layers of webbing that you get trapped in, that shoots at you, then I mean, and the thing is, like when you've got this like giant armored fist, obviously you've got 2 choices. You can meet it with an equally large giant armored fist, or you can wear it away through attrition and slow it down until it can't advance anymore because it's lost all its momentum. And that's obviously the choice they chose, right?
Yeah. Basically, the Kursk salient has been described as the most highly defended place on the earth. So they did the amount of defences put in place around the Kursk salient is sort of unbelievable.
So what kind of defences are we talking here?
Okay, so they built, first of all, trenches for men, sort of slip trenches, 10,000 kilometres worth. I think I mentioned before, they said it would stretch, if it was in a straight line, it would stretch from Moscow to Madrid.
Yeah.
Also, anti-tank ditches. Now, to call it a ditch is not really, it's a massive, massive, long pit.
Right.
Because even 1940s era tanks were quite good at getting over and through difficult ground.
Yeah.
So you'd need a ditch where there's like a sheer wall on one side. And so it would need to be demolished. They'd need demolition teams to blow up the far side of this tank ditch in hope to get tanks through it. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons worth of earth had to be moved. Miles and miles and miles and miles of barbed wire. Again, 3 main battle defensive lines, but in some places, it's like some places even more than 8 lines. I've heard up to 16 lines of defences. They would create defensive positions, or redoubts, they get called, where there's like an anti-tank gun in it. And they would camouflage it. Apparently, the Soviet camouflage of anti-tank gun emplacements were brilliant. Even the Germans, the battle-hardened veteran Germans, didn't see them quite often until they were right on top of them. Their ability to camouflage these anti-tank positions, anti-tank redoubts, was brilliant.
I mean, it just sounds really silly for the Germans to be like, yeah, okay, we're going to attack now. It's like, no, go and do something else. Go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Wait them out. I don't know. Do something, but you can't just walk into this.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I thought, obviously it's with hindsight, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I thought what might have been a good idea is by the end of June 1943, if they just decided, why don't we take everything we've amassed here and push straight back towards Moscow with it? Just ignore Kursk.
Yeah. Go somewhere else. Force them to, because if they're playing defensively, they're reacting to you. I suppose it is, and I'm sure they had reasons, on those people on the ground doing it. But you've got the most well defended position in all of human history. No, we're not going to walk into. Obviously, we're not going to walk into it. It'd be ridiculous.
So yeah, like I said, it's the most well defended place on the earth. Yeah, but also in all of history, you could argue.
Yeah. Well, there's never been so many men defending any one place with so many fortifications ever. So we're not walking into that. That would have been if were I in charge. Yeah,
I've heard it described as a vast defensive belts. So they're like these lines, and what they would do, sort of obviously, is have where they would use, if there's any sort of river or canal, use that, build that into the defensive line. Anywhere on the ground where there's any sort of rise in the ground or dip or anything, utilize all of that. And in the front 3 lines of these defensive belts, the main 3, they would have gun emplacements or redoubts or defensive positions that were no more than 600, 800 metres apart. And what they would often do, quite often, is wait until some or the first bits of the German line come through, and then you fire on both sides.
Yeah.
So enfilade fire and hitting tanks on the side is so much better than hitting them on the front.
Yeah.
And again, lots and lots of the German accounts are, we didn't even see these defensive positions until they started firing on us. Even though they're only a few hundred yards away, even though we're battle-hardened veterans, we still didn't see them. They were sort of masters of camouflage. And they used, the Russians, even though they had a few million men, they also used loads and loads of civilians. Again, hundreds of thousands of civilians from the Orel and Kharkov and Kursk regions to build these. Even female kids, sort of 14, 15-year-old girls, everyone, for 3 months were digging these tank ditches and trenches and putting out barbed wire. And one of the main things is mines. Because no matter how good your armour is on your tank, on your Tigers, if it runs over a mine...
Your tracks are blown and you can't move. That's, what is it, 50 tons or 100 tons or however, it's just scrap metal, basically.
Yeah, right, 55 tons, a big Tiger, one of the big Tigers, So they laid an ungodly amount of mines around the defences at Kursk. Something like 5,000 mines per mile.
I'm not sending my tanks in there. That's what I'd be thinking. Are you stupid? Obviously I'm not sending tanks in there. I'm going to go somewhere where there aren't 5,000 mines per square mile. Again, I'm sure the Germans had their reasons and stuff like that. But I'm just looking at this thinking, well, if I was playing a war game, I'd be like, well, obviously not there.
Yeah.
Wherever it is, Well, I don't know if I've got to pull back 100 miles or something to get the Russians to come out from behind their defenses, whatever it is, I would take some other action than forward into. I mean, again, I'm just armchair generaling this, but I just can't imagine because the Germans can't have been ignorant of the level of defenses that the Russians had, right? They've got aerial reconnaissance. They know that saying, right, okay, we've got 100 miles of defenses to get through here. 1 mile is too much. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Just can't get over it.
It's one of the things that military historians always say. That was it's kind of dumb. OKW of the senior German command to still pull the trigger on it when they knew.
And the Germans weren't stupid, so they may have been evil and German, but they're not stupid.
Well, it's like at Agincourt. It's like the French knew by 1415 not to try and charge against a longbow storm, arrow storm, but they still did it. It's like, why did you do that though?
Well, with Agincourt, you could argue lack of overall command by the Dauphin, and the impetuousness and the chivalric nature of the knights has blinded them to logic and reason, and that there are actually explanations for it. Whereas for this, you guys don't have any of those excuses. You've got one guy who's in total control, who's got very experienced generals around him, and you're actually your modern thinking. So it's not like you're like, okay, well, even if we die, we go to heaven, or we get captured and ransomed. You're not thinking like that.
Yeah. There's lots of reasons. I mean, on the German side, it was sort of a point of prestige, or they were thinking, well, okay, it is a meat grinder and we're going to get ground up, but we need to grind them up. That's sort of what the point as well is, that we need to. But the amount of mines alone. I mean, one of the Soviet sayings was, let's have a mine for every tank, every man in the German army. Let's have a mine for them.
This is a good saying, actually.
And apparently they hid them really well. And of course, at night, you certainly can't see them.
No.
And that's how the Germans did lose loads of their armour, by running over mines.
But they did.
Some of the senior commanders like Guderian and Hoth, apparently they were just absolutely exasperated that they'd lose Tigers from a bloody mine.
Yeah, the mine probably costs a thousandth of the tank. Right. It's cost effectiveness here is just crazy.
And the other thing is that particularly on the northern front of the Kursk salient, is that they kind of knew. They didn't know exactly where the Germans were coming from, but they kind of knew roughly where it was likely to come from. For example, there was a break in the forest about 90 kilometres wide.
Yeah, and they're like, so put mines there.
Yeah. So let's make the mines even thicker there.
Yeah.
And what they would also do is sort of during battles, the Soviets would see where an armoured column was coming from and send people out to lay mines in real time in front of them. Yeah. because
It's a good move.
right.
Yeah, sensible.
And the German high command, there's accounts of people saying you wouldn't believe how quickly the Soviets could lay a minefield right in front of us. Right.
I would, send out 1,000 guys with a mine each, and that's a large minefield you've got in about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So
they said they could lay 30,000 mines in a day or two.
Oh yeah, I could totally believe it.
Yeah, mad.
Yeah,
incredible.
Yeah.
Everything in this is just, the scale of it is just off the charts, really. Unbelievable. Yeah, endless, miles and miles and miles of barbed wire. Okay, so the Russians had something in the order of 20,000 anti-tank guns. Whereas they couldn't have, endless tanks, they could have quite a lot of anti-tank guns, just artillery pieces, really, of all types, of anything they could get to the front.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.